It's 1:44 a.m. and I can't sleep again. I'm lying on the far edge of the king-size bed, feeling isolated and alone, even though my husband was only inches away from me on the other side. He couldn't sleep if anything was touching him, so not once had I awakened in my husband's arms, or even so much with him touching my hand. So there was this large gaping space between the two of us throughout the night. That went on for our entire marriage. I remember lying awake that evening, going through every element of the day to see if I could find where I had lost my way. You see, I'd woken up that morning feeling hopeful about our marriage, thinking I can do this. But now I was lying awake, wondering, how could I possibly do this for one more day? I had spent the last several years convincing myself that my husband had enough good qualities and that I needed to just learn to live without affection and connection. My husband was 6 feet tall with short dark hair. He worked out religiously 4 days a week. He worked hard at a stable government job, liked watching football, ironed his clothes for the week ahead every Sunday night, and packed his lunch each evening before going to bed. He paid the bills, took care of all the yard work, followed the rules, said please and thank you. My husband was and still is a good man with a kind heart. I married him because I knew he wouldn't hurt me as others had before him. He was the safe option, and together we created a perfectly fine marriage, one with low drama, low passion, and low connection. And I feared I wasn't going to be fine with fine forever. I began asking for more affection in our marriage, but he had come from a long line of unaffectionate men, so this wasn't an easy ask. He wanted to know exactly what he needed to do, almost like a checklist. I'll give you an example of what this looked like. I told him I needed at least one hug every day. Yes, we were starting with the basics. Being the dutiful husband that he was, I remember him coming up to me one evening and giving me one of those one-arm buddy hugs so that he could check it off the list for the day. Well, now I knew I was going to have to be more specific. I told him, I'm going to need you to give me a two-hand hug each day, not side by side, but face to face. He did it for a little while, but when I gave up wanting to be prescriptive and didn't want to be that nagging wife, the daily hugs fell by the wayside. So now it was 1:44 a.m. and I was lying awake on the far side of this king-size bed, and the thoughts spinning around and around in my mind were varying versions of, how can I keep doing this? Why can't I just be fine with fine? What's wrong with me? He's a good guy. If you leave the good guy, you know you're going to be judged. He's the same guy that you married. He hasn't changed, you have. Can I stay, or is the only answer for me to leave? I wanted more in my marriage, even though at the time, I'm sure I couldn't have articulated exactly what more looked like. My parents had a perfectly fine marriage. They'd been married 50 years. I had a big family, and all of my family members had perfectly fine marriages to good, solid people. My marriage didn't look that different than the marriages of many of my friends, as far as I could tell. I knew I wanted more affection, and I wanted to feel closer to him. I wanted a level of intimacy. Now, I'm not talking about sex. I'm talking about intimacy. That's different. But where was that class? Was there a class on creating intimacy and connection with your spouse over the course of decades? Maybe I'm the only one that missed that class, but I bet I'm not. I expressed these things to my husband about how I wanted more in our relationship, and I said words like connection, affection, and intimacy without being equipped at the time to give him any real productive roadmap on how to create that. And it wasn't all on him. It's not like I knew how to do that either. I began noticing other couples and how they interacted. Most weren't dramatically different from us. They looked more like roommates and friends, more so than lovers and confidants. But then there were those couples that were connected, who looked one another in the eye, who were present and undistracted as though the rest of the world fell away. And they weren't afraid to use simple physical touch as a means of expressing their love. So I knew this existed, but could my husband and I create that type of relationship together? That was the question, and I wasn't feeling terribly optimistic. We would try, but it felt difficult, even awkward. I felt like a nag. I felt like I was having to beg for attention and affection from my husband. And I'm sure it didn't feel good from his perspective either, being told all the ways he's falling short and that his wife is unhappy in the marriage. You see, we both wanted to feel good inside the marriage, but neither of us knew how to do that. And because I was the one pushing for the change, I was also the one then feeling the gap between what I wanted to feel and my experience inside the relationship. After a while, it became easier to just fall back into our old patterns, our old ways of being, continue the dance we'd always done, and me going back to convincing myself to be fine with fine. I was not unlike most people who find themselves struggling in their marriages at the time. It's sometimes easier to remain stuck in a pain that we know, the same pain we woke up in the day before, the month before, even the year before. In many ways, it actually serves us to remain stuck in a place of indecision when we're in that stay or go question. That way, we never have to take any action that scares us to death in one way or another. We don't have to do what it would take to make it work. We don't have to really take that difficult and vulnerable action and possibly face failure. We also don't have to walk through the fire of divorce either. We don't have to impact our kids, our families, our friends, our lifestyle. We don't have to divide everything up and potentially sell the house and move. We don't have to start all over again in another relationship who will likely have their own set of issues as well. And then I realized why we couldn't transform the relationship. I wanted my husband to become something he wasn't. I was essentially trying to get an apple to become an orange. And at the same time, I was attempting to be someone who I wasn't. Someone who was willing to be in a marriage that lacked all the things my heart was longing for. And when we deny our own needs, we're not telling the truth of who we are, and we're betraying our own hearts. He was the only one that was telling the truth. I just didn't like the answer. Once I could see that clearly, I gave up the fight and started to tell the truth to myself and to my husband. There was nothing wrong with him, and it was unfair for me to ask him to change. I had been trying to change him into being who I needed him to be rather than seeing, loving, and accepting him for who he truly was, and just admitting that we weren't a good match together. I realized there was nothing wrong with my husband. I also realized there was nothing with wanting what I wanted in my most intimate, most important relationship. I knew the marriage was complete, and it was time I freed us both. 10 years ago, my answer for my heart and my marriage to this question was ultimately to leave, and I've made peace with that decision. But when my clients are struggling in their marriages, my story, while maybe interesting, is completely irrelevant. That was my answer, and it doesn't mean it has to be anyone else's answer. This is such an important and deeply personal question. It requires a great deal of truth-telling and soul-searching. It has far-reaching implications, literally impacting generations of people when children and grandchildren are involved. And at the end of the day, we've all got to be able to look ourselves in the mirror and feel proud of how we navigated this question. So today I am a coach for women who have been stuck in this should I stay or go question for far too long. Now, my job is not to guide them to my answer for their lives. Not to their mother's answer, their sister's answer, or their girlfriend's answer. What those people think that they would do if they were in their shoes, but to guide them to their answer for their hearts and their lives, one that they can feel at peace about. If we're going to remain in a marriage that's struggling, then the marriage has to evolve. It has to evolve to what I call the 2.0 version of that marriage so that it can feel good for both people. What you had is what got you here, so we know that doesn't work. Where you're at today doesn't feel good. So we need to evolve the relationship and create something new together. Just like Apple comes out with a new version of their phone that is an improvement over the prior version, that's the evolution that a struggling marriage needs to experience in order to fix what's broken. And if we're going to leave the marriage, we don't have to hate our partners or make them the villain of the story. We don't have to blow up our lives and leave a trail of anger and venom and hate in our wake. I've had clients that were on the edge, finding their way back to one another to create something beautiful in a brand new way together. And I've had clients who've made the decision to release their marriages, but they did so gently and lovingly. Heck, one of my clients went out for ice cream together after signing their divorce papers, and another just celebrated the holidays together as a family, even though they were no longer married. I do not have a judgment that one choice is right and the other is wrong. I think the only answer that's wrong would be to never answer the question for yourself. If you're ready for real clarity about whether you can fix your marriage, or if your answer is to leave without regret, I invite you to fill out the application in the link below to see if it makes sense for us to explore working together in a one-on-one coaching capacity. I receive sometimes 50 applications a day, so the application process is pretty selective, and I'm not an inexpensive coach. But this is a decision that shouldn't be taken lightly. I'll see you on the other side.